With the rise of global warming, carbon emissions are having an increasingly large impact on the Earth. Throughout history, we see a dramatic positive correlation between carbon emissions and income. In particular, Russia is one of the countries that shows an interesting pattern with carbon emissions, especially during the 20th century due to the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. From 1920s up until the 1990s, there is a quick increase in both income and in carbon emission. According to Laura Henry, a government professor at Bowdoin College during the Soviet period, both rapid industrialization and communist policies resulted in severe ecological damage. One of the major factors that led to environmental damage included common ownership of natural resources. Since individuals had common ownership, this in turn discouraged conservation by individuals or firms. Because of this, the overuse of natural resources led to environmental resources such as air or water having little value, and thus were depleted. This caused CO2 emissions to dramatically increase, illustrated in the Gapminder graph. The monopolization of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic Party and the overall structure of the political party even led to complacency in terms of environmental issues and overall lack of debate or even talk about the environment. The political structure of the party, in addition to the rapid industrialization and depletion of natural resources, overall led to almost an indifference for the environment. When we look at the correlation between carbon emissions and income in Russia, we see a dramatic decrease in carbon emissions in Russia in the 1990s. We can infer that this might be due to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, which decreased production while the government was in turmoil. There was a sharp decline in the income of Russia and carbon emissions, possibly due to the decreased production reflecting the economic collapse. Since then, Russia has had a similar amount of emissions but a slight increase in income. Studies show that the collapse of large parts of the Russian economy during the 90s led to a 30% decline in the use of energy and a resulting reduction in emissions of about 40% by the year 2000, with only moderate increases since then. Around 1990, in the time of the Russian Civil War, Russia's income and carbon emissions fell drastically. During a civil war, a country's main concern is the war at hand, causing the income to decrease because of the increase in military spending and decrease in production during wartime. A strong correlation can also be seen between carbon emissions and income in the United States. During the stock market crash of 1929, the data shows a large drop in income and carbon emissions. This drop may be due to the decrease in production, jobs, and market activity caused by the crash. Less production could also be responsible for the decrease in carbon emissions of the country. Carbon in the atmosphere decreased in the late 30s and early 40s due to more regulations on carbon emissions. In 2013, carbon emissions have continued to decrease due to the large societal view that we must prevent global warming and care for the planet in the United States. Carbon emissions were the highest in 1970, but the Clean Air Act of 1970 placed a regulation on emissions, and they have never been that high again. So do carbon emissions really impact income? There is no causation between the two. The United States produces the second most amount of carbon emissions each year and maintains a relatively high income. However, when the carbon emissions decrease, the country's income remains roughly the same, sometimes rising. High carbon emissions tend to represent the wealth of a country. In some cases, income continues to increase without increasing carbon emissions, showing that a country can limit carbon production and still make a profit. Prior to viewing the Gapminder graphs, our group hypothesized that CO2 emissions as a negative externality of industrialization would have a negative correlation with life expectancy. CO2 is toxic and many global efforts are being made today to preserve our future. Surprisingly, CO2 emissions have a positive correlation with life expectancy. CO2 emissions have no direct impact on our health, and they do have a direct correlation with industrialization. CO2 emissions are caused primarily by the burning of fossil fuels, which is only possible if a nation has access to the scarce resources. Smog is a result of pollutants and can pose a direct risk to our health, but these pollutants do not include CO2. Many of the countries with the lowest amounts of CO2 emissions are located in poverty-ridden areas with little to no industrialization, such as Ethiopia or Somalia.